Please welcome to the stage Jacqueline Miller, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Seattle.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'd really like one of those voices from beyond to help me out at home getting the kids up for dinner and stuff. But thank you all for joining us tonight on this lovely evening. It's a great opportunity to hear from some of the leading China experts in the country. Bonnie Glaser, Eugene Goltz, David Kang, and Ryan Haas, who it must be said is a Husky and brought many members of his family tonight, including his 93-year-old grandmother. So be very nice to Ryan. So when Bruce Jones at Brookings reached out to me to see if we would be interested in partnering with them on this event, it was a very quick and a very easy yes for us. Creating opportunities for debate and discussion on global issues is what the World Affairs Council has been doing here for 67 years. We work to raise global IQ in Greater Seattle. And it's my hope that all of you leave here tonight with your global IQ raised at least a few points. And I don't think that's going to be hard to do when we hear from our debaters who are going to expose us to different ways of thinking about this crucial US-China relationship and possibly, hopefully, challenge our thinking. We were chatting a bit during the reception and the debate had already started. So I think we're going to be in for a real treat tonight. I want to commend and thank the Brookings Institution and the Charles Koch Institute for thinking outside of the Beltway and bringing debates on America's changing role in the world to cities around the country. And I also want to thank them for focusing on fostering vigorous, constructive, and importantly, civil discussions. We can disagree without being disagreeable. And it's always good to get outside of our own echo chambers, to be exposed to different ideas and different approaches. And so far, Brookings has hosted debates in St. Louis, Las Vegas, Atlanta, just last week in Dallas, and saving the best for last here in Seattle, although technically it's the best for second last because next month they're in Detroit. But all of these debates have been civil and constructive and engaging, and I know that's going to happen here again tonight. And far too often, the other Washington doesn't think enough about the many constituencies outside of the Beltway that have insights into some of the major foreign policy issues of the day and who are strongly affected by those decisions that are made inside the Beltway. I was inside the Beltway for a dozen years, and it's now being out here on the other coast, outside of the Beltway, being outside of the East Coast, that it's so clear that scholars, academics, and policymakers have to get out more. They have to get the pulse of the rest of the country and to listen to the insights and impacts from outside of DC and from outside of New York. And when it comes to China policy and the course of the US-China relationship, Washington State is disproportionately affected by the policy decisions made, and Washington State has unique insights and relationships. China is Washington's #1 export market. 20% of our state's total goods exports go to China. Everything from Dreamliners to cherries to running shoes. We probably have the highest level of engagement with China of any of the 50 states. And it's these close ties that have prompted visits from China's last two presidents, President Xi Jinping in 2015 and Hu Jintao in 2011. And it's those close ties that prompted Brookings to bring this particular debate to Seattle. They haven't all been about the US-China relationship, but to have a debate about the US-China relationship, you need to have that in Seattle. And it won't be surprising for you to know that we're ending up our program here with a strong focus on Asia. There is a lot going on there. Tonight's event, of course, is a highlight. But on June 14th, we have former US Ambassador to Mark Lippert coming. He was ambassador to Korea until January of last year. And if the Trump-Kim summit goes off as planned, big if, but if that goes off as planned on June 12th, he'll be here 2 days after that summit to help us figure out what happened. Our members know how to register for events on our website, and I know I'll be seeing a lot of your faces at our Wednesday discussion on Russia with former US Ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul. But if you're not a member of the council and you'd be interested in joining the conversations that we host or joining the council, please just visit our website. I need to quickly thank the Washington State China Relations Council, who was a terrific partner in promoting this event, to their members, and I'm pleased to see some of the board here tonight from the China Relations Council. And with that, I'm delighted to get off the stage and let the real fun start. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Jacqueline Klimas, great first name, a national security reporter at POLITICO, and ask the panelists to join us on the stage, and let's get this discussion going. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much for everyone here for joining us. I want to welcome you all to the 5th debate on America's changing role in the world, convened by the Brookings Institution, the Charles Koch Institute, and in partnership with POLITICO. I'm Jacqueline Klimas. I'm a national security reporter at POLITICO. And we're very happy to be here in Seattle for tonight's debate, co-hosted by the World Affairs Council of Seattle. Thanks to Jacqueline Miller, who stole my joke about the great first name, for opening tonight's event, and thank you to our audience for joining us here. I'm also delighted to be joined by Mona Lee Locke, who will be moderating the question and answer portion of tonight's debate. This debate continues a series of visiting cities across America to foster a vigorous and civil discussion about the future of U.S. foreign policy, and tonight's debate will focus on the future of America's relationship with China. Hardly a day passes by without a significant development in U.S.-China relations, from President Trump's tough stance on trade issues to a new national security strategy that labels China a strategic competitor. The relationship between Washington and Beijing is changing, and this evening we're going to dig into what that means and why it's important. Just to give you kind of a run of show for tonight, the debate is going to happen in 4 different segments. The first round will be moderated by me. The question and answer session with questions from our audience will be moderated by Mona. There'll be a second round of debate moderated by myself, and then brief closing statements from our participants. To keep the conversation moving, we've asked our debaters to limit their answers to 90 seconds each. Our audience is encouraged to submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld or in writing on note cards that will be collected by debate organizers about 15 minutes into the first debate segment. And without further ado, let me introduce our participants for the night. Ryan Haas is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow with Brookings John L. Thornton China Center and Center for East Asia Policy Studies. From 2013 to 2017, he served as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia on the National Security Council. Previously, Ryan was a foreign service officer stationed in China, South Korea, and Mongolia. Next to him, we have David Kong, who's a professor of international relations and business at the University of Southern California, where he also directs both the Korean Studies Institute and the Center for International Studies. Dave's latest book, American Grand Strategy and East Asian Security in the 21st Century, was published in autumn 2017. Bonnie Glazier is the senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where her research on Asia-Pacific security focuses on Chinese foreign and security policy. She's worked for more than 3 decades at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy at CSIS and as a consultant for the Department of Defense. And last but not least, Eugene Goltz is an associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. His work centers on the intersection of national security and economic policy. Eugene has served in the Pentagon as a senior advisor on manufacturing and industrial-based policy, and he holds a PhD in security studies from MIT. So with those introductions done, let's dive right in. Brian, I want to start with you, since you helped shape the U.S. Strategy towards China in the Obama administration. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what America's interests in China are, if those are different from America's interests in the broader region, and why the average American should care about that.
Well, thank you for such a softball question to start out tonight, Jacqueline. But first of all, I also wanted to thank Jacqueline for hosting us tonight, and also as a son of the Northwest, a graduate of the University of Washington, to explain how proud I am to be back here with you all. Before I answer your question, I do also want to acknowledge my family, including my grandmother, who's here with me tonight. Thank you. Why should the United States care about Asia, and why should it care about China? I think it's a central question. I think that it's a central question of our time. It is an open question whether the United States and China will be able to coexist. Rising power and established power. There's a past pattern of conflict between rising powers and established powers. But to get to your question, I think it's important to bear in mind what Asia represents to the United States. Asia is the growth engine of the global economy. 60% of global economic development occurs in Asia. Asia is the largest source for U.S. exports. It is the home to 5 of our treaty allies. It is the place where the most proximate threat to the United States exists in North Korea's nuclear program. It is the place where the greatest strategic challenge to the United States over the next generation exists in terms of China's rise. And so what happens in Asia matters intricately to what happens in the United States. That's the baseline that I think that we approach this question from.
So Dave, I'd like to ask you to respond to that. Do you agree with Ryan's descriptions of what the U.S. interests are in the Asia Pacific? And I'm hoping you can also give us a little bit of a sense of China's perspective here. What does China want, both for its relationships within the region and for its relationship with America?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in some ways I totally agree with Ryan that both of these countries are very important, and we haven't come up with a status quo, stable equilibrium between the two. I think one of the things that I would emphasize when I look at it from the other perspective is that I think that in the United States, this isn't a artifact of the Trump administration. There is a long-term trend that other countries are becoming more important. And I'm not sure the United States has really grappled with what it means to have appear in some manner that we actually have to live with. I also tend to be a little more sanguine about our ability to do so, because I don't think any country, China or the United States, are necessarily threatening each other's interests the way that the Soviet Union did. So in some ways, when I look at how the United States and China are interacting, and as China looks out at the region, of course it's trying to find its own place. I think the United States is now trying to find, is the post-war architecture that we've had for 60 years, 70 years, do we need to keep it the same? Do we need to adjust it? And I'm not sure we've really asked that question as carefully or as blatantly as we probably should have.
Bonnie, it looks like you would like to jump in here. Would you like to respond to Dave?
I would. I'd like to comment on some of the things that I think China seeks in the region. The Chinese have never made it any question that they oppose American alliances. They have said since the 90s that alliances are Cold War relics. They want to reduce American influence in the region, and the Chinese essentially want deference from all of their neighbors. The United States does not have any territorial ambitions in the region. We don't want to take away other people's territory. China has disputes. It's disputes with territorial disputes with many of its neighbors. And when some of China's neighbors do things that are seen to be against China's interests, the Chinese are actually using economic punishment, coercion against these countries like South Korea, which, concerned obviously about the threat from the north, deployed missile defense, the THAAD defense system, and the Chinese have been punishing them by not sending tourists. And this is just one example. There are many of the Chinese wanting to change the organization, if you will, of the region to create their own security mechanisms. Xi Jinping himself said in 2014 that Asia should be organized by Asians, not obviously by the United States, not seen as an Asian country. And I think that these pose challenges to the United States.
I'm hoping to get you to expand on that just a little bit. Given China's size and economy and power, does that necessitate that China will be the center of any U.S. policy looking at the region?
My own view is that the United States should not organize a policy towards Asia that is centered exclusively on China. We should be supporting our own vision of Asia with the Asians. We should be working with like-minded countries to preserve international law and norms. We should be creating an environment in which business thrives, commerce thrives, in which military ships can move through all waters. The Chinese, for example, want to say, oh, military ships can't go in exclusive economic zones. That's 1/3 of the world's waters. Do you want to bar all military ships from moving in those waters? So, I guess I think that there are, the United States needs to have our own strategy supporting our own principles with our partners in the region. We have to deal with the challenges to our interests as they arise. Right now, they are primarily coming from China, but they could come from elsewhere, and I don't think that our policy should be centered on, particularly on China. I think it should be more what I would say is outside in rather than inside out. So some administrations have said, let's get it right with China, let's have more cooperation, and then let's fit everybody else into that strategy. And I think it should be the other way around. We deal with our allies and partners, those we share values and principles with, and we use those relationships to try and balance China and promote better Chinese behavior. Hasn't worked very well.
Well, great. So, Eugene, I'd like you to respond to these views as well. Do you feel that this makes the United States too responsible for security and stability in that part of the world? And is there a way to look out for these interests that others, other debaters have described without getting significantly involved in the region?
It's a really good question and sets up very nicely. So the first thing I would say is that the three other debaters answered very clearly a number of issues in U.S.-China relations and the importance of China. We trade a lot with them. They're important dynamically, economically, but they never talked about U.S. interests, what the U.S. interests are. They said China might challenge our interests. And I think actually that was your very first question and is an important thing for us to consider, right? So what is the United States? The United States doesn't have interest in China. We have interest in the world, as Bonnie said. And our interests, I think, first are in security, prosperity, and liberty for Americans, right? The reason we formed the U.S. government and have a foreign policy of that government, what the government is responsible for, is protecting security, liberty, and prosperity. Now, we wish good things in other countries as well. We wish them to be secure and prosperous and to have freedom. And so we look, it's nice that that people have come out of poverty in China. That's a good thing for the world. It's sad that there's more surveillance and threats to civil liberties in China, right? We can have opinions about those ideas, but the core of our interests, those are nice to have things that we might want to push for, but what we would start with is what is happening in Asia that affects our security, our prosperity, and our liberty. And we're not really in a position today. China is an important country that someday might threaten our security in various ways or might pose a challenge, but they're not there yet. And so we don't have to react. We don't have to manage the security of Asia for our own security interests.
Anyone like to weigh in, please?
We have 70 years of history to draw from and learn from in terms of American leadership in Asia, and I think that we've learned a few lessons. And I don't dispute that our goal is security, prosperity, and liberty. Who would dispute that? Of course everyone supports security, prosperity. The question is, how do we achieve it? And I think that the lessons of the last 70 years teach us a few lessons. The first is that when the United States is active in Asia, when we play a leading role and an agenda-shaping role, we spur collective responses to shared challenges. Whether it's natural disasters, whether it's climate change, whether it's rules on trade that govern 40% of the global economy, the United States is the first actor that incentivizes action by others. That's important if we don't want to inherit and take on the burden of every problem that exists in Asia. The second is that the United States' presence, continuous presence in Asia, has helped to cool historic rivalries, serve as a buffer between states that have very fraught histories with each other, and provide a restraint. I think that's important, and I think it's served our interest. The third is that the United States has played a leading role in spurring and incentivizing movement towards rule of law and human rights in Asia. It's made it easier for companies like Boeing and Microsoft and Amazon to do good business in Asia. And the fourth practical reality is that if the United States retreats from its leading position in Asia, China will fill the vacuum. And it will create a region that doesn't necessarily correlate with our long-term interests.
So Bonnie, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about some writing you did in 2007. You wrote an analysis of China's peaceful development, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little about what has changed since then and what has stayed the same.
Just repeat that last part. Sorry, I didn't hear.
What has changed since you
What
wrote
has
that in
changed? What has
2007,
stayed the same?
and what has stayed the same? Yep.
Well, China's interests, not surprisingly, have grown. If you go back to the 70s, 80s, China was very much really a domestically focused country. Their interests started expanding. The Chinese used to talk about their immediate periphery, and then they expanded really to the whole world. As China started importing, in 1993, it became a net importer of oil and, of course, other resources. For a long time, the Chinese were intent, I think, on avoiding friction, particularly with the United States. And we saw as China became more powerful militarily, but still lagging, of course, far behind the United States, primarily economically, the Chinese have been more determined to stand up for their interests. There were times where the Chinese would just say something and it was a phrase. And then now they're increasingly operationalizing it, like seeking to weaken U.S. alliances and exert pressure on countries to accommodate to China's interests. So what we've seen is a more assertive China, more willing to defend its interests. Nobody should be surprised by that. When China was a weak country, it was unable to do that. And so I think the question is, how does China pursue its interests in a way that it doesn't undermine stability in the region, the interests of smaller countries, the interests of the United States? And this is a challenge for all. China does have a right, certainly, to have some of its interests addressed as well.
So for several decades, the United States has made assumptions about a rising China, that it would liberalize and that it would come into alignment with international norms. Ryan, you've written recently about this, so I'd like to start with you. Do you think those assumptions were valid?
Well, thank you, Jacqueline. It's an important question. Many analysts and commentators on the U.S.-China relationship have talked about how there was a theory of the case with our engagement with China, that increased engagement would lead to convergence and that eventually China would become a liberal free market democracy just like us. I must admit, I haven't met a practitioner involved in the relationship that shared that view, and I think that's an important distinction. From a practitioner's perspective, we wanted to push China to emerge as a constructive and not a coercive actor on the world stage.
Mic is not working. Is it? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
They'll raise the volume in the back, I think.
So we wanted to get China to be a contributor in addressing problems like the spread of Ebola in Africa, to deal with development challenges, to help us shoulder the burden on Iran or North Korea, and at the same time to discourage China from taking actions that challenge our interests or undermine rules and norms. That was the nature of the exercise. And it was intended to strike a balance between cooperation and competition, to maximize cooperation where we have shared interests and to manage competition in areas where we don't, in a very clear-eyed, direct, candid way. And the goal was never to suppress China's rise. It was to try to encourage China to rise in a direction that was favorable and not undermining of our interest.
Dave, I'd like to get your response here as well about American assumptions about a rising China. Is the U.S. a little late to the game with these assumptions? Has China already risen?
Yeah, in many ways, I think we're asking the wrong questions, but I also want to say nice shout out to the home crowd there. Go Sounders. Okay, I'll try. No, like that. I can't quite do the same. I think in some ways, we have a couple contradictory images of China, and I think both are wrong. The first one is, which was also a straw man, as Ryan said, the more they rise, the more they'll be like us. I mean, come on, right? The second one is, history teaches us that rising powers fight declining powers, so therefore war is inevitable. You've probably all heard this. Both of these, I think, are missing what's going on in Asia right now, which is in many ways, China has already risen. In East Asia, in 1990, Japan was about 70% of regional GDP of the size. You took all the economies in Asia, Japan was 70%, and China was like 10%. Those numbers are shifted now. China is already by far the biggest country in East Asia. Yes, it hasn't caught the United States, but in Asia, it passed everybody else without us even noticing it, and without any fighting. And yes, there are some residual disputes that are going on. Residual disputes over maritime claims that don't challenge the security or the survival of any country. So in a way, I'm not surprised that in some ways the region is more stable than we tend to think. The task is that we haven't got this equilibrium yet. But to put it in these stark terms, I think, is to miss what's going on in the region, which is a country that has already reclaimed a place where everybody else is focused on it. And we are now figuring out how to live with each other.
So, Eugene, some argue that the U.S. should maintain a strong military presence in East Asia to prevent a war among regional players that would actually impact the global economy. But in 2009, you argue that the global economy is a complex web that can survive if a few strands are severed. Is that still true today in the more interconnected world?
Yes, I think that's still true. I want to be clear. I don't think that if the United States changed its policy, it would necessarily lead to wars. I don't think wars are a good idea. I would hope they don't happen. I would most especially like the United States not to be involved in wars, especially with other quite large, powerful countries, right? So, my priority is first to keep the United States out of fighting, then to have there not be fighting in general. And then the question is, as we're getting to the follow-on effects of wars, do they wreck the global economy inherently? Well, the answer there is clearly no. We've had lots of wars historically where wars are lousy for the economy of countries that are fighting, but for countries who are not fighting the wars, neutral countries often do quite well economically during war times. There's a lot of historical evidence about the changing patterns of global trade. Global trade doesn't stop. Trade tends to stop between belligerents who are fighting each other, but they both are interested in trading with other countries. So, the web of international trade, the options available in international trade is incredibly diverse today, is more diverse than it has been in the past, right? Those alternative options, the ability of the global economy to adapt to disruptions in one place by trading somewhere else is even greater now than it was during World War I or World War II or times during the Cold War when there was open conflict. So, I don't think that, the key reason you might be concerned about conflict in Asia is that somehow it would hurt economically.
So with that, we're going to move on to our next sort of theme of the night, which is going to look at alliances and stability in the Pacific. A heavy U.S. security presence through alliances and military deployments is often justified to maintain this stability between China and its smaller neighbors. So Dave, I'd like to start with you. You've argued that regional neighbors are less frightened of China than Washington might think, and you've hit on this a little already tonight. You write that while the region has numerous issues still to be resolved, countries think most of these issues are not worth fighting over. So broadly, is East Asia less unstable and less anxious than we often believe? And if so, what's wrong with that? What are the traps that DC can fall into if they're thinking that way?
Sure. No, I mean, this is probably one reason that I'm not mainstream, per se, because I think East Asia is more stable today than it's been in 100 years. If you look back, actually maybe 150 years, right, with the coming of the Opium War and then the rise of Japan and imperialism and World War II and Vietnam and Dien Bien Phu, which was, we just had that thing, right? The last 50 years or so are so much more peaceful than the 100 years that preceded it. And it's important for us to recognize that the trend is going in one direction, and there are still some spots, there are some residual spots. But then in reality, most countries aren't preparing for war because they don't see that these issues are actually worth fighting over. And so in some ways, the way that the United States has a set of alliances. So I was just in D.C., we had a nice argument, but Bonnie has a different view on this, right? Because I was talking to someone who, in D.C. who said, but our American troops are incredibly important. And I said, well, we used to have 100,000 troops in Korea, 50 years ago, and nuclear weapons, and now we don't. Now we have about 28,000. It's not the number. Clearly, we can reduce those numbers drastically, and the countries are not responding the same way. There's a lot there. And the point of this is that, yes, military alliances are an important thing. But as Ryan has pointed out, as we've all pointed out here, America's relations with Asia are economic, they're cultural, they're diaspora, they are much broader than just military. And so countries with us and countries with China are dealing with both as if they were broader than just military. And to look at it as only one misses that. Because China is only going to be more important, not less. And so countries are acting that way.
So Ryan, I'd like to get you to weigh in on this as well, because you've previously argued that countries in the region don't want to rely on China or the U.S. They want to rely on both. So given that, I mean, are there any differences or anything you'd like to say to respond to David?
Well, I'll offer a few thoughts, but Bonnie, I know you wanted to jump in. Do you want to?
Go do that first.
So my sense is this, is that countries in Asia, like the rest of us, would like to have it all. They'd like to have the economic benefits of a close relationship with China, the security benefits of a close relationship with us. And I don't think it's necessarily in our interest to force any country to choose. But the question I think David is getting at is, what has our security presence in Asia got us? And my argument is that it has created a security umbrella in Asia that has allowed countries to focus not on fighting each other, but developing the engine of the global economy in ways that have benefited the United States and particularly companies in this state. And if we take away that security umbrella, the question is, what happens? And my view is that countries would face a choice. Countries in Asia would either have to choose to accommodate China, to accept a certain Finlandization of Asia, where countries are deferential to China on issues that China cares about, or work collectively to defend themselves, or arm themselves. And what that means in practical terms is that countries like Japan would face a choice about whether or not to go nuclear to defend themselves. If Japan goes nuclear, South Korea goes nuclear. If South Korea goes nuclear, then there's a risk that Taiwan will go nuclear. And you can see where this domino leads. And does that put us in a safer place? Does that better protect America's long-term strategic interest? My view is that what it does is it increases the risk of catastrophic conflict in Asia, which is an outcome that our strategy is designed to prevent.
Bonnie, would you like to respond?
I agree with Ryan, and we'll just add a few points. And that is that I think, when I travel around the region, every country wants the U.S. military presence. They may not all want it in their country. They all want it in the region. They want the United States to be militarily present. They don't want to have to accommodate to a larger China. They want balancing. And of course, not just from the United States. You look at a country like Vietnam now reaching out to Japan, India. They want to have relations with other countries that they can use to preserve their interests. So again, if you take one example from Vietnam, they want to develop oil in their exclusive economic zone. By the way, so do the Philippines. And so Dave said earlier, that the challenge isn't, China isn't challenging the survival of any country in the region. Well, according to President Duterte of the Philippines, actually Xi Jinping has threatened war if they go ahead and unilaterally develop that gas field at Reed Bank. And the Vietnamese have also been intimidated. They have had to shut down the drilling. And by the way, Exxon is involved in one of the blocks. So this is the Chinese claim jurisdictional rights. They claim historic rights. So yes, we can quibble over what the word survival means here, but these countries want the United States to help them to push back. And what you have is the Chinese using all sorts of tools that are very difficult for, I think, us to push back against.
Would you like to
Yeah, I would, because I'm
All right.
glad we talked about the Philippines, right? So in 1992, Subic Bay, at the height of its existence, Subic Bay employed 36,000 Filipinos and was the largest naval base in the world outside of the United States, larger than anything the Soviet Union had. In 1992, as some of you probably know, Philippines voted not to renew the base lease. Since that time, this is not a Duterte phenomenon, not a single Filipino president has said, let's bring back a permanent U.S. military presence. So in 1992, there were 13,000 U.S. troops deployed permanently in the Philippines, large enough, again, to dry dock aircraft carriers. This year, there's 36, all involved in a Mindanao counterinsurgency. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to say in general terms, yes, people like the U.S. military presence. And of course, in some generic fashion, it might be nice. But the Philippines itself has not been saying, wow, we have this problem with I'm running out of time, with Spratly Islands, therefore let's get the U.S. military back. What the Philippines did was not a military solution. That's the point. When they took China to The Hague, that is an economic, that is a diplomatic, that is a multilateral solution. And I think for us to focus purely on the U.S. military side is to miss what these countries are doing themselves.
And what do we do about the fact that China rejected that finding by the arbitral tribunal?
I want to go to Eugene to weigh in here.
Sure. I disagree, I think, pretty dramatically with most of the other people up here on these kinds of questions. I mean, I think
We have a four-way.
Yes, we do. I agree with Bonnie that most of these countries in Asia aren't interested in giving up. They want a balance. They don't want to become, they don't all want to learn to speak Mandarin and study Mao's Red Book. That actually gives me confidence that these are countries that will seek to protect themselves and take care of themselves and preserve their own liberties and preserve their own freedom and security without the United States. They can play a bigger role in their own security. The challenges that we're actually facing in the region are that military technology is moving in a direction that makes it easier to defend land across water. Right? You can sense oncoming ships. You can hit these ships with precision weapons. It's harder to cross moats, right? What people call the stopping power of water. And that's actually a problem for the United States today, because when we try to protect other countries, we have to cross a giant moat and enter into the region of the world where China is sensing us on our ships with our limited military capability and can attack us and keep us out. However, for China to be on the offense itself and threaten Japan, threaten Taiwan, threaten the Philippines, take anybody else, they have to cross a moat. And that same technology that's increasing the cost for the United States to provide defenses to these other countries makes it easier for them to defend themselves without us. And I'm out of time, but in other conversation that we might have, it actually, we threaten to destabilize the region by trying to force our way in, by threatening to force our way in for purposes of defending these countries that could defend themselves.
So Eugene is talking about the anti-access area denial weapons, and Ryan, I'm hoping you can talk about whether or not, you're welcome to respond to that, but also whether or not the United States can decrease its troop presence if they sell advanced defensive weaponry like that to nations like the Philippines or to Vietnam.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say about Eugene's comments, they're very provocative, they're thoughtful, and they sound great in theory, they just don't reflect reality. The Philippines' most advanced naval platform, is a decommissioned Coast Guard vessel that we stopped using decades ago. The Philippines doesn't have advanced sensors and anti-ship cruise missiles that it can use to defend against an oncoming attack. My view is that the best way to see an outcome that we want to avoid is to make these countries defenseless so that there is a low threshold for China or others to seek to use military tools to achieve political ends. That's what we're trying to avoid. And if the Philippines at some point in the future develops the capacity to defend itself, to become a porcupine that can resist all outside attack, then I'd be all for the view that Eugene laid out. The problem is we just aren't there yet. And so the same problem occurs with Taiwan, with Japan, with many other countries in Asia. And the solution isn't to just pull back and see what happens. The solution is to make these countries harder and tougher and better to defend so that China or others don't have the impulse or the instinct to try to act on any ambition that they have by using their military means to achieve their political objectives. Thank you.
Ryan, no one would say that we should leave these countries tomorrow defenseless, right? You're right. The Philippines and all these other countries want the United States there because we protect them and they don't have to take care of themselves. It's pretty nice to be, taken care of by a powerful, rich uncle, right? But it would be, if the Philippines don't have these systems today, we could buy them for them if we really had to, and it would be cheaper and less risky than what we're doing today with fighting, right? With promising to fight with American troops. It's not that they have the capability today, it's that they could have it in a phased transition to be able to defend themselves, and that would be a more stable and more secure world than the world we're in today.
I know I see lots of heads shaking on the stage, but we're unfortunately needing to move on to the next section of our debate. I'm sure these are conversations that will continue, long after tonight.
We've been having them for
So
20
now
minutes.
I'm going to hand off. We'll fight it out later. I'm going to hand off to Mona Lee Locke for the. She's a former First Lady of Washington who lived at the embassy in Beijing from 2011 to 2013. So she's going to be handling the questions that have been submitted by our audience and on Twitter.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And small world of things, we were, Ambassador Locke and our family were in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing at the same time Ryan was there. Ryan and his wife, and they did a great job, as are all of you. We're going to take a couple questions from Twitter first. And this is directed to any of you in general who want to answer. Is it in the U.S. interest for China's economy to grow? Or is China's growth more of a threat than an opportunity for Americans? Bonnie?
So we'll see how much disagreement there is here. As I think Ryan said earlier, China provides, I think it's 60%, according to the Asia Development Bank, of total economic growth. So it's almost 2/3 of economic growth. Absolutely an opportunity. We should never pursue a strategy that is trying to slow down China's growth. China has brought more people out of poverty than any country in the world, they like to say. We should not wish that these countries would not do well. But the question is China growing at the expense of others? And I think what President Trump has been pushing for has been more of an even economic playing field. So there's a lot of things that the Chinese do that are essentially unfair, requiring, for example, some companies to transfer technology as a condition, working with joint ventures in China. They certainly have in the past used cyber-enabled theft to steal IPR. They don't protect IPR very effectively. So there's a lot of ways that China has used even the World Trade Organization, since it became a member in 2001, to its advantage. And so the question is certainly not, do we want China to grow? And we've had enormous economic opportunities, and all of Americans buy cheap goods at Walmart and Target because of that. But I still think we have to answer the question of economic growth at whose expense? And if it's at ours or other countries, that's a bad outcome.
So on a whole, is it a threat or an opportunity?
It's both.
Oh, that's
Sorry.
like cheating. Oh, come on. Really?
Sorry.
Anyone else?
It's both.
Ryan?
So it's a good question, and it's not the first time this question's come up. This is a question that's been rattling around for decades, and many of the people in this room have actually been working on this issue for that period of time. I spoke with someone during the reception who first traveled to China in 1935. So we have a lot of longitudinal depth in this room. But here's what I would offer. The idea that we could isolate China and seek to impede China's growth falls on three faulty assumptions. The first, it's impractical. The United States has struggled to slow the growth and isolate North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and other countries. How are we going to do that with the world's second largest economy, the most integrated economy in the global trading system? I don't think it's possible. Secondly, it's counterproductive. If we went down this path, we would invite a very hostile response from the Chinese, and we would separate ourselves from the very partners that we would seek to isolate China. No other country in the region, let alone the world, wants to put themselves in an economically adversarial relationship with China. And in addition, it's dangerous. This would lead us down a very dangerous path in our relationship with China that could be destabilizing. Now, I understand the criticism. A lot of people have frustration about China's unfair trade practices, and it's true. There is reason for frustration. But what many people cite as the basis for their frustration may not be entirely accurate. Many people cite the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States as the proof that China is acting unfairly. In reality, that trend began before China entered the World Trade Organization. If you look at the line of the loss of manufacturing jobs, it's a very clean, linear line before and after China entered the World Trade Organization. And secondly, 80% of job losses in manufacturing in the United States are due to automation, not China. And so I think it is important. I applaud the spirit of what President Trump is trying to do in trying to create a more fair and equal trading relationship, if not necessarily the tactics that he's using to pursue it.
Okay, I'm guessing no opportunity or threat with you both.
I think it's more opportunity than threat.
Okay.
So if I might just say a quick thing, I mean, I agree with the vast majority of what Ryan said. Like, we're on the same page about trade and economic opportunity with China. But I would go back to the interests the United States has that I talked about. The place people put a fine point on this, we clearly, I think, have a prosperity interest in China's economic success. All of our theories, about trade, say in the long run, it's mutually beneficial. It improves efficiency on both sides of the trading relationship due to comparative advantage or economies of scale or a whole bunch of other reasons why trade makes sense. So to support American prosperity, a lot of the prosperity we've had in recent years has been due to, on the consumption side, importing things that we want from China that they're making more cheaply, and that helps our economy control inflation, a whole bunch of things. And also on the financial side, we borrow a lot of money because they have a very high savings rate in China, and that helps the United States to invest in this country, right? So we benefit economically. Well, people who worry about this often would say, yeah, but there's a trade-off in that other interest the United States has in security, that as China gets wealthier, they can afford to invest more in building their military, and that threatens us, and we should be nervous about that, so we should be willing to sacrifice our prosperity interest. And I think it's crucially important to understand that they're a mile off from the ability to threaten us on the security side. The kind of economic growth they've been having is benefiting us on the prosperity side, but is not putting them in a position where it's dramatically changing, at least yet, the kinds of security threats they pose to the United States. So it's a false trade-off for the United States.
Okay, thank you. David, did you want the last word on this?
Yes, actually, I do. No, of course I do. No, I will. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, so this thing, right? We've been having this question for at least 20 years: is a big China threatening to the United States? If you believe in the balance of power, and that big countries are powerful and inevitably threaten other big, then absolutely China's rise is a threat. But none of our policies actually reflect that. Right? We have people, some of my academic colleagues have been making that same argument since the early 90s. Bigger China, more threatening. But in many ways, do you want a big, rich China, or do you want a poor, weak China? Often, we don't have a choice. That's not our choice. I think in some ways we overstate our ability to affect either one of those. China's going to do what China's going to do, and we only have to react to it in some ways. And I think in some ways, thinking about it that way is a very different type of way of viewing China, right? It gets away from who lost China in the 1950s to are we going to keep them big or small? There's very little we can do about it. Much of what's happened, and the way I would put it is this: would you rather have a China today, despite what's going on in China and the Great Wall, the firewall, and all that kind of stuff, or a China from the late 1960s or 1970s, before it opened up to world trade and capitalism? I think we're unbelievably better off, and the Chinese people are better off today than they were 50 years ago. And so on balance, I would say absolutely. It's managing that rise.
It's always about managing. Here's a question from the audience. Talk about the role of China in Africa and the relevance of that to U.S.-China relations. Any takers?
So the Chinese invest quite a bit in Africa, and the usual view in the United States is that these are countries that could use investment, and it has the potential to contribute to economic growth and poverty alleviation. Now, the challenge has been the United States actually has preferences in how that investment gets made in Africa. We like strings of various kinds. We want it to come with political and economic reform in these countries, and when the Chinese invest in these countries, they often don't demand the same kind of political and economic reforms, and sometimes the Chinese bring their own labor force and don't lead to a lot of development in the local economy, and there are frictions with how that investment is made. But the idea that people are interested in investing in Africa is not threatening to the United States goals or anathema to the United States goals. This is something that we're open to. The problem is we're pretty nosy people. We're a little meddlesome in international affairs. We like to tell people what to do, how to spend their money. And not surprisingly, the Chinese and many other people don't like it so much when, some people like it when Uncle Sam takes care of them. But people don't like it when Uncle Sam tries to tell them rules and tell them how to live their lives and how to spend their money, and that creates friction. And so if we were a little less meddlesome, then yeah, okay, we're going to invest, the Chinese are going to invest, hopefully it's going to cause some economic growth.
Bonnie?
I would just add to that briefly. I agree with everything Eugene said, but it's a very mixed picture. Some of China's investments are they're bad investments. They're building a large amount of debt in some of these countries. It's very high interest loans that they could never pay back. The fact now that the Chinese are actually looking for more, I think, strategic gains. They now have their first military base in Djibouti is just one example. But it's a complex picture. Some of China's investments, I think, have been good. They have produced good returns. Companies have made money. Some of them have even hired local laborers. They are learning over time. So if you look at this over the last 10 years, you will see certainly some learning curve and you will see some positive examples. But there are also huge problems that they have created in some of these countries. And Chinese have built, palaces for dictators. But you can't just simplify that story. It's a very complex one.
Okay, thank you. Next question from the audience. Can China maintain its economic position with an aging population and no social safety net? Any takers?
So this is an excellent question about China's future, and I guess I would say I think the only honest answer is, I don't know, right? Like, my crystal ball is not that good. Tea leaf reading has never worked out for me. Tarot cards, I don't have the forecasting, the insight. But it is true that a lot of our assumptions about China are based on straight line projections, about the threat that China might pose to the United States are based on straight line projections of they've been growing at 10%, 7%, whatever people decide the current number is, and it's going to go on forever, and they're going to overtake us, overtake the world, and flatten us. And that's clearly, it could happen, but there are many other paths where things they have internal difficulties. They face the so-called middle income trap. They have a decade of stagnation like Japan did. There are many ways they face the aging population where we are in the enviable position as the United States of being pretty safe, pretty powerful, pretty rich, and having the opportunity to wait and see. Right? So I don't know if China will continue growing like this or will flatten out or will run into a financial crisis because of their aging population. But I don't have to pick right now from that array of options.
Okay, thank you. This next question, Brian, I'll ask it of you. We've traditionally practiced diplomacy with China a certain way. How has President Trump changed that landscape? And positively or negatively?
Wow.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my question.
That is such a great question.
It's a great question. Ryan can answer.
Well, I think that we're seeing the conduct of diplomacy in the U.S.-China relationship take on new dimensions that exceeded my imagination 18 months ago. The idea that we would conduct diplomacy via Twitter is a new concept. It's a concept that we were talking beforehand that I'm not sure the Chinese fully appreciate or know how to interpret. And it's as much confusion as it is clarification in Beijing whenever President Trump decides he has a thought on China. But I don't want to be glib about this because this is a serious issue. When the Obama administration left office, there were about 100 dialogues on everything from what are you doing in Africa and why are you doing that, to how are you guys going to change your economy to make it green, to how are you dealing with aging. Really, every issue, the United States and China were knitted up. And even though we didn't agree, we were talking to each other. We were learning from each other, and we were trying to gain a better understanding of what China was trying to accomplish. When President Trump entered office, he decided that that's too much, too diffuse. We need to just focus on 4 dialogue mechanisms and use those. Those lasted 1 year, and now there are 0 existing dialogue mechanisms. We don't have an existing channel of communication. We have ad hoc channels that deal with issues as they arise. And to me, this is a imperfect and dangerous way to deal with the most consequential relationship in the United States faces.
Bonnie?
I would add one additional point that President Trump has introduced, which I think Ryan would confirm that this was not something we did in the Obama administration, was to mix a set of security issues with economic issues. So we have a situation where President Trump has said repeatedly, if China helps us with North Korea to bring about the goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, that we'll give China a good deal on trade. And so this idea that we use one as a lever to get something else in another area, I think is new, and that the Chinese, early on in the Trump administration, the Chinese were quite worried that President Trump said he was not going to reaffirm our one China policy, which has to do with the fact that the People's Republic of China is the only representative government of China in the world, but we still have a relationship with Taiwan, and so the Chinese were very worried that he was using that as a bargaining chip to get something out of them. So this idea of linkage across different categories, I think, is relatively new in this administration.
Okay, David, question for you. You said that the trend in Asia is towards stability. So what could upset that trend? What are some of the factors?
That's a great question. In fact, we're looking at one right now, which is North Korea, right? Again, if you go back, say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, most of these countries didn't exist. Singapore, Malaysia, 50 years ago, most of them feared for their survival. Today, there's really only two countries that fear for their survival, and that's North Korea, not South Korea anymore, North Korea, and Taiwan. And even the Taiwan relationship has basically sort of reached some kind of a status quo that we all can sort of live with unless it's upset, as Bonnie pointed out. But these are really the two flashpoints that I can see totally upsetting things. And in many ways, what makes Trump so interesting is not that the long-term trends were going in one direction and he's turned them around. Much of what was happening in the United States was happening before Trump. There was a concern, one reason Obama talked about a pivot or a return was because there was a concern that America hadn't paid enough attention to Asia. And so the Obama administration was going to try in a way to pay more attention. So Trump potentially upsetting things was not the first time that's happened. But in many ways, like the thing that's going on with North Korea now is we have it linked in places we didn't know before. We had a way of dealing with North Korea that at least we knew how to deal with it. And we don't really know now on their side or on our side what's going to happen.
And kind of following up on that side in a way, how does the impact of President Xi staying in office indefinitely impact our relations with China? Do you think it helps, or is it a detriment?
I think it's a new dynasty, right? We all saw it coming. I think all of us saw this coming, that the plans were being put in place to go through the typical 10-year term that they had all agreed to take after Deng Xiaoping. And you could see it coming over the last couple of years. And every summer I spend a month or so in Korea and China, and you can see all these wall posters talking about Munmyeong, I don't know how you pronounce it, Chinese, civilization and all. You could see the propaganda coming along, right? But in many ways, I think what's interesting about this is that reflects Xi's internal focus. And one thing that we haven't talked a lot about is, we talk about how China's being sort of aggressive externally, but I think in many ways still Xi is focused on domestic stability first. And I think if I was to guess about Xi, I would say he wakes up in the morning, he's probably more worried about what's going on within China than he is externally. And that's where I think a lot of the focus is. But I would defer to these guys.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ryan and then Bonnie. So Ryan.
So I think that the charitable explanation that some people have tried to offer to Bruce Jones and me and others as we've traveled through China is that China will face a convergence of challenges in the next decade. Declining economic growth, aging society, lack of social safety net, increasing challenges from a declining United States against a rising China. And that all these things will require a strong, stable, steady hand to guide China through that process. That may be true, that may not, I don't know. But what I do know is that, or what I believe is that this decision is going to have the effect of exacerbating all the bad elements of Leninist top-down political structures. It is going to create policy constipation, whereby it's hard for good ideas to float to the top. It's going to create problems with local enforcement and implementation of central policies, and because no one's going to want to do anything until they know that Xi Jinping himself has blessed it. And it's going to create a lack of flow of information through the system. No one's going to want to report bad news to the top. And it's going to create a winner-takes-all, everyone for themselves dynamic amongst the top leadership as everyone fights for their survival to position themselves for the moment when Xi Jinping passes from the scene. And so my expectation is that we're going to see more volatility in the Chinese political structure, not less, and that the risks to policy execution in China are going to bleed over and impact on the U.S.-China relationship.
Bonnie?
So I agree that if too much power is concentrated in the hands of one person, that is bad. Many people, I think, in China don't want to give the top guy bad advice. So that's the negative side. But maybe in the short run, there are some positive ramifications of Xi Jinping saying that, or the policy that there will be an elimination of the two presidential term limit. And that is that Xi Jinping gets things done. So if President Trump says to him, go ahead and shut down the smuggling along that border, he can't do it 100% with North Korea, but he can do better. He can do more than Hu Jintao did in the past. He has better control over the military than Hu Jintao had, and that was a problem for the United States, because the PLA was in some ways, I don't want to say rogue, but did things that, the top guy really didn't know about. And so in the short run, I think there are some potential positives. That said, I think it's very negative for the Chinese people, especially if this goes on for a third term and a fourth term, and then we end up with a sort of, a Putin-type figure in China. There are many negative implications over time.
Okay, and this is the last question in my section. It's about human rights. We had a little discussion backstage about this. The question really is, should it be factored into our economic policy during negotiations? Let's start with Eugene.
I think we have to recognize the limits to our understanding of politics in other countries and the economy in other countries, including in China. So I'm a little uncomfortable with the discussion we've just had about thinking about what are the implications of, Xi Jinping staying for more terms, the ups and downs of politics. We had a horrible record of understanding the details. I mean, sinology is becoming a little like Kremlinology was. Our ability to predict in other countries, what the results will be. We can't predict our own politics very well, right? Do we really think, whatever. We don't understand things we're deeply familiar with. So the idea that we can make fine-grained calculations in our economic relationship about the effects that tweaking trade policy in this way or putting this economic sanction in that way are going to have on human rights behavior or other political issues that are quite important to the political leadership of another country that we don't understand very well. It seems very challenging to me to think that we have the kind of information we need to make a positive difference. Now, that doesn't say to me that we shouldn't complain all the time about bad human rights behavior. We shouldn't make clear what we think is appropriate. We shouldn't talk to people. This is an important part of the relationship and of diplomacy with other countries. But we need a pretty heavy dose of humility about our ability to manipulate other countries, especially powerful countries like China.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Jacqueline.
Well, great. Thank you, Mona. So now I want to turn to a few questions on a different aspect of the U.S.-China relationship that's been in the news a lot lately, and that's trade. Just last week, top-level officials from both countries held a second round of talks in Washington to try to avert an all-out trade war amid, rhetoric that's just getting more and more heightened. So Ryan, I want to start with you. In reviewing the accomplishments of the U.S.-China relationship, you've previously pointed out several positive things: that China's integration into the global economy has made it the leading contributor for global growth, a source of profit for U.S. firms and exports, and that Chinese cooperation was crucial to preventing the worst of the 2008 financial crisis from happening. Yet despite all this, we've seen growing skepticism of China as a trade partner. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a good question. I think that a few things are happening. The United States is going through an intense period of change right now. We went through the Industrial Revolution. I would argue that we're going through the technological revolution right now. And it is turning things upside down. It's making people feel insecure and uncomfortable about their future and the future for their children. And I think that's one element that's feeding into this discussion on China. The other is China is big. It's really big, and when it moves, we feel their movements. And China is operating a state-led economic model that doesn't accord with the vision that we had for the way that the global economy would develop. It doesn't accord with the rules that were established in the World Trade Organization that we helped to usher into existence. And when China does things, I'll just give one specific example to illustrate the point. When it decides, for example, that it needs to dominate the solar industry, what does it do? It goes in and it pours billions and billions and billions of dollars into the solar industry, collapses the solar industry until such time as the only real actors that are alive and in existence in the global industry are China. And now China has a nearly dominant position in the solar industry. So the fear is that China will replicate this with semiconductors, with artificial intelligence, with automation, with other things, in ways that will erode and hollow out the American economy. And I think that's why there's so much intensity around this issue right now.
Bonnie, go ahead.
I would just add 2 points. I agree with Ryan. First, I referred earlier to the Made in China 2025 program, and this is essentially 10 very strategic sectors where the Chinese are looking to be dominant, so semiconductors, electric cars, AI, robotics. It would be, again, be fine if it was an even playing field, but the Chinese government subsidizes these companies, and so they really do have an unfair advantage. The other point that I would make is that the Chinese really like process. They like to get you in a room and have meeting after meeting to talk about the same problem over and over again, and some of these have gone on for 20 years. It's really nice that in the U.S.-China joint statement that was just released 2 days ago that the Chinese said that they would protect IPR and they would strengthen their laws. I don't know, we got Bob Cap laughing there. Yeah, this has been going on a long time. When the Chinese signed up for the World Trade Organization, they said they would join the government procurement agreement at the earliest possible date. That would provide equal opportunity, for U.S. and Chinese firms to bid for government contracts for, federal, state, local governments. The Chinese have laws that require government purchases of domestic goods. So Xi Jinping gave a speech at Boao in March, and what did he say? We're going to accelerate our accession to the government procurement agreement. So the Chinese really have tried, I think, to use process as a substitution for actually making progress. And so I share the frustrations, I think, of many American businesses and certainly many people in the Trump administration.
So this competition from China is not only investing in technologies itself, but it's also purchasing American technologies. So Eugene, I'm hoping you can weigh in on this. Do you think people are as concerned as they need to be, or as aware as they need to be about China trying to pilfer U.S. technology?
So this is a good question and a complicated question. So are people as aware as they need to be of things the Chinese do through foreign investment to allow them to get access to American technologies, to allow them to gain advantages? I think the answer is probably no. There are lots of clever strategies they can use without following through on the kind of investment we hope for, or wrapping things up in process that allow them to see technologies that, like in a due diligence process in foreign investment, they see the technology and then they don't follow through with the investment because they've already got what they wanted. There are lots of tricks they can play. The problem is that in an open capitalist economy, as we have, the kinds of regulatory solutions that have been proposed to address that are worse than the disease, in the sense that if we do things that allow much greater government regulation of foreign investment into the United States, or much greater government insight into proposed foreign investments to allow the kinds of blocking that people who are afraid of China might see, that would really put a damper on lots of other economic activities in the United States that actually contribute a lot to our economy. And given that the security risks that we face with respect to China, again, in that hierarchy, that prioritization of US national interests, having our prosperity continue due to a pretty free environment for foreign investment and other kinds of investment in the United States is more important to the United States than the security risks, because China is way down here and way far over there. So we don't give up as much on the security side as we gain on the economic side.
Would anyone like to respond to that or weigh in on that?
Bonnie's
Okay.
dying. You're dying too, Bonnie. No? All right.
I'm
Okay.
going to let Ryan do it.
Moving on. So, Bonnie,
I don't want to dominate this debate, but now you come back to me. Go ahead.
so some critics of U.S. strategy towards China have said that the U.S.'s focus on security objectives, that they focus on security at the expense of trade and economic goals. Do you think that Washington has over-prioritized security concerns in its relationship with China? And if so, is that a mistake?
Well, that has changed, I think, from president to president. I do think that under President Obama, there was not enough priority that was put on the problems in the economic relationship. And I talked to many people in the Obama administration who look back and say they should have tried to put more pressure on China and not gotten caught up in what I talked about was sort of the process and the procedures. That said, you really have to do both. I believe that China does pose military challenges, it poses security challenges, economic challenges, diplomatic challenges. The Chinese are now putting forward their economic model as an option for other developing countries. I think that's actually a problem for the United States. I'm sure maybe others on this panel might disagree. But I think that there are challenges when you have a political and economic model in China that is not fair and abuses a lot of people and then puts it out there for other countries to learn from. So I think you can't necessarily prioritize one over another. It does depend on the nature of the threat. And if this government thinks North Korea is the biggest threat, if it gets an ICBM, mates a nuclear warhead with it, then it should pursue that. But I don't think it should be linking trade with that. It should just be saying that is our top priority. And frankly, when you tell a leader like Xi Jinping, this is my number one issue, you're more likely to get a positive response than if you say, and the following 10 things are really top priorities.
Would you like to respond, Ryan, as someone who was inside the Obama administration?
Sure. I'll just offer a historical perspective that may provide a contrast to what we're experiencing now and the Trump administration's approach to China. In the last administration, I think Bonnie's right. If we had a do-over, we would have done some things differently. But on the whole, I think there was a theory to the case. The idea was to have a three-pronged approach to dealing with China on economic issues. The first was to deal with the area around China. So to have Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP with EU countries, which would establish new rules for high standard trade in 65-70% of the global economy. And it would create pressure on China to either move up and adhere to those rules or self-select and isolate itself from the emerging set of rules for governing global trade. That was the first prong. The second prong was to push for market opening with China through a bilateral investment treaty and other initiatives that we had in a direct bilateral sense to try to create more opportunities for American companies to export their goods and services to China and to increase competition within China. And then the third effort was to work with China both to pressure it to live up to the existing rules of the road. The Obama administration brought more cases at the WTO against China than any administration before it, but also to work with China to establish new rules in areas where they were needed, such as environmental goods and information technology, areas that don't currently have rules. So there was a coherent theory of the case that was multifaceted and it was intended to push China down the path of reform.
So Eugene, you've
change.
previously written about a strategy of restraint which calls for reduced American military engagement abroad while maintaining trade and economic ties around the world. Does President Trump's, or do President Trump's concerns about the U.S.-China trade imbalance trouble a strategy of restraint?
So President Trump's concerns about the U.S.-China trade balance might be troubling for lots of reasons. Most people don't think of the trade balance as the sort of key indicator of whether trade is working out well or not working out well. Some of the rules and whether rules are followed, whether intellectual property is stolen. There are a whole set of other things that have been discussed a little bit that we might want to try to improve our trade relationship. I would say the overarching trajectory has been incredibly positive in the sense that having China start to participate in the global economy has been positive for many people in the global economy. Having China join the WTO, accept some of the rulings in WTO cases, as Ryan mentioned before. Like, the trajectory is not perfect yet, but is positive. That's a separate question from the question of militarily, should the United States have an aggressive forward presence around the world, have peacetime alliances with a lot of countries that have the technological and financial resources to do a lot more defending on their own? Should we be continuing the trajectory of military investments that fight into the teeth of the technological trajectory of anti-access and area denial capabilities, that we're doubling down on an ever-increasing cost and an ever-increasing risk set of military investments that we could get out of by adopting a policy of restraint, by changing our military posture and our alliance relationships, right? So yes, we should do things to make trade better, and yes, we should do things to make our military posture better.
So Dave, I want to come to you. You've advocated previously for an increase in diplomacy and economic engagement and a decreased reliance on military might. So in the current political moment of these concerns about trade, is increasing the use of those tools even feasible?
Yeah, I mean, and in some ways, yes, I totally think so. And what I want to do is add a little bit of historical perspective that's come up here, which is when I talk about how the region is actually more stable, TPP is not an American initiative, and I think it's worth pointing that out. We didn't come up with it. This is not our thing. Mm-hmm. The region came up with it as a way to manage and deal with and engage each other as well as China. There's a lot that's going on in the region itself that we overlook. And something, Bob, you probably know Joe Massey, I'm sure you know, right? He actually, I think, retired around here. He used to teach at the Tuck Business School when I taught out there at Dartmouth. And he was the USTR in the 1980s, U.S. trade representative for China and Japan. And he used to say, I'm the trade representative for the two largest socialist countries in the world. Because, of course, Japan totally intervened, and they totally picked winners and losers. And half the time they were failures. And one thing I'd want to point out is I think in some ways the reason that we're not worried about Japan as much as we used to be 30 years ago is not because we pressure Japan. Japan's still doing the same things. It's because fundamentally that model of interfering and picking winners and losers doesn't work as well as our model, as bad as our model is and as badly as we do it. And so in many ways I think, right? I would still pick us 30 years from now to be a more dynamic, innovative economy than a country that's trying to pick winners and losers within that kind of an environment. And so the point is, yes, we need to keep the pressure on. I'm not a Pollyanna about China, but it's as much realizing what the region is doing and what's actually going to be a source of change within China, which is probably more China itself, and we can sort of help to nudge it along, but it's not ours to control.
So you talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I feel like we can't talk about China and trade without talking about TPP. So I'm hoping to get your thoughts about how the Trans-Pacific Partnership should fit into the U.S. strategy and how China fits into that as well. Would one of you like to start? You, Ryan?
Go ahead.
I think that clearly when the Obama administration came to TPP, which was late, I mean, I think the president was sold on the idea that this was a strategic approach. I know people who work at USTR who still think there are problems with TPP after all the chapters were negotiated, but it is more strategic in that it's setting environmental standards, labor standards, ways of doing business. There's a whole chapter on, how to deal with state-owned economic enterprises. And so I think the idea was that eventually China would be compelled to join, because being outside of it would have been detrimental to Chinese interests. But nobody expected that China would be able to join in a very short time frame. But I think that that was the dominant view in the Obama administration.
Okay. So now I think we're going to leave trade and move on to the final section of our debate. We couldn't talk about China without looking at what that all means for North Korea. So next month, President Trump is expected to meet with Kim Jong-un.
We were already at war on this
We were already arguing over that.
This highly anticipated meeting in Singapore between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, though recent news at the summit could be scrapped, shows just how delicate the situation is. And since coming into office, President Trump has expressed both optimism and pessimism at Beijing's willingness to intervene here. So, David, as a prolific writer on North Korea, I want to start with you. The president has talked about really that there's no way to get a deal with North Korea unless China get involved, how critical it is for China to be involved here. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how much influence China really has over North Korea and whether China even has the same goals for the Korean Peninsula that America does.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we all think and we all agree that China is important to North Korea. But the thing we overlook is that, yeah, China has more influence on North Korea than any other country in the world, but it has less influence than we think it does. The idea that somehow if we pressure China, or if China, for whatever reason, China decides to pressure North Korea and North Korea is just going to jump, is totally false. The Chinese and the North Koreans really don't get along that well, and it's honor among thieves. And so there's influence there. And yes, China could cause North Korea to collapse tomorrow if they really pulled the economic plug. But they're not going to do it because the costs are enormously high. On their border, that's where North Korea, you knock over North Korea, it's right there. The same reason, yeah, we could cause North Korea to disappear tomorrow if we started a war. We're not going to do it because the costs are too high. And North Koreans are many things, and one thing that they really are is very stubborn. And so this is not a relationship that is one that is built on an equal agreement on interests. And Kim Jong-un is clearly repairing his relationship with Xi Jinping. But North China goes between denuclearization and stability. And I'll defer to the other China specialists who know more than me, but I as yet have not seen them really prioritize denuclearization over stability on the peninsula. And as long as until they really do that, it will remain at the margins of influence.
Fabulous, I agree 100%. So let's talk about China's goals. China does not share U.S. goals on the peninsula. China wants to essentially have the Korean Peninsula within China's sphere of influence. So, would probably like to keep North Korea intact. Another socialist state falling isn't too good for Xi Jinping at this point. But actually, I think that reunification under certain terms would be acceptable to China. And what are those terms? That's no U.S. forces on the peninsula, a very different alliance, and probably some people up here might think that's okay. But I think that the United States wants to see a united Korea that would be essentially a democracy and under South Korea. It's possible that there could be a confederation in which North Korea remains intact. Maybe China would be willing to accept something like that. But ultimately, the Chinese really care about a united Korean peninsula that is very closely aligned with the United States, the potential for U.S. forces being deployed north of the 38th parallel, even listening posts on Chinese border. So I think that ultimately our goals longer term are quite different. Does China want to get rid of nuclear weapons? Sure they would. But you know something? They are getting rid of the one thing they worry about most, and it's that testing site, because what the Chinese care about is the potential for contamination of air, water, and soil in northeast China, because that has been a danger to Chinese political stability, not the presence of nuclear weapons.
So, Ryan, I want to move to you to get you to weigh in on this. Looking at the upcoming summit, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how much the personal relationship between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping actually matters in these negotiations, and whether Trump can be friendly with him and gain his support for these negotiations with North Korea while maintaining his hard line on trade.
It's a great question, and I'll draw from my experience being around Xi Jinping a handful of times. He is one of the least emotional, most hard-nosed, sort of brass tacks calculator of his interest and China's interest that I've ever been around. He is not someone swayed by charisma or dazzled by persuasion. He's someone who clearly and thoughtfully thinks about what serves his interest best. And so every time I see President Trump suggest that his great personal relationship with President Xi is going to deliver the day, I cringe because I don't know what he's talking about. But beyond that, if North Korea is President Trump's top priority, and I believe his sincerity when he says that it is, I don't understand why the president would choose to launch an aggressive trade action 6 weeks before he starts a summit with Kim Jong-un. It just betrays a lack of forethought or planning, and it mixes signals. And then for the president, as Bonnie suggested, to come back and say, well, we can be a little lighter on trade if you can be a little nicer on North Korea. Well, that sounds great in kindergarten. It doesn't work in the real world. and so I just, I hope for the best. I applaud President Trump for making the effort to engage Kim Jong-un. He's taking a risk in doing so, and he deserves credit for that. But we aren't yet at a point where I have a high degree of confidence that what happens on June 12th will lead to an immediate outcome.
So I want to dig a little more into the relationship between these two men and come to you, Bonnie. You wrote in 2008 that some of the key behind some of the successes on North Korea during the George W. Bush administration was presidential communication and credibility that enabled Washington and Beijing to overcome divergences in approaches and mutual suspicions. Do you see the two current leaders of the U.S. and China approaching that same kind of relationship?
That was 10 years ago. No, I actually do continue to believe that that's true. As I said earlier, if you go to the Chinese and you make it very, very clear what your top concern is, your top priority, and you're looking for China to help, you have a much better opportunity of getting China to work with you. They won't work against their own interests, and we shouldn't expect them to. But the example, of course, of being more compliant with the UN Security Council sanctions and putting pressure on North Korea is a good example. That works two ways. I believe that Xi Jinping also went to President Trump and said, you know, the restrictions that you put on ZTE, they've put this company out of business. You need to lift those restrictions. So it does work both ways and not always to our advantage. This is not unique, in my view, to the U.S.-China relationship. Whenever two leaders sit down and have a conversation, they have to have credibility more than anything else. I don't know if this president has a lot of credibility with Xi Jinping. I'll give you a very short anecdote. When President Bush met with, I believe it was Hu Jintao, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and he said, I am going to give the Dalai Lama the Congressional Medal of Honor, and I'm going to the opening of the Olympics. And he was under a lot of pressure in the United States to not go. But he did both. And so the Chinese knew when George W. Bush said something, they could take it to the bank, whether it was something bad for China or good for China. And having that kind of predictability and credibility, I believe, has greater potential for two leaders to work together effectively.
So I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. military presence on the peninsula. And Eugene, I want to start with you. As we've approached this upcoming summit next month, several commentators have expressed concerns that President Trump might agree to a North Korean suggestion to remove U.S. troops from the peninsula in exchange for denuclearization, but you've previously argued for the voluntary gradual removal of U.S. troops from South Korea. So is there a danger in withdrawing U.S. forces from South Korea, and what message would that send to China?
Well, if you want to use the U.S. forces in South Korea as some kind of bargaining chip with North Korea, unilaterally withdrawing them first is not going to be helpful. The question you might ask, or I might ask, is whether the U.S. forces being in South Korea are constructive for American interests or constructive for stability in the world. So South Korea is an eminently capable country. It's a country that's technologically sophisticated, has a well-functioning government, has quite a lot of money. Its GDP is more than 30 times bigger than the North. Its population is more than twice as big as the North, right? This is a country that has tremendous capability to defend itself if it chooses to do so, right? It doesn't actually need, if given time to prepare, like if the US left tomorrow, they would be in the lurch, right? But they have the resources that they can replace the US effort to defend South Korea. It's not the situation that existed when we first went to South Korea, 65 years ago or whatever it was. So I think strategically, we could pull back. It would be better for the United States. It would be better for things on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I don't expect denuclearization to be a likely outcome, even treating this as a bargaining chip. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it also strikes me that in terms of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, anything we could do, whether it's through a joint agreement or through a unilateral action to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula, things that walk us back from the brink of war are a good idea, and we should take those actions.
Does anyone want to respond to the potential troop withdrawal and whether or not that should be on the table in the upcoming summit?
I'll offer a few very brief thoughts. I think that the idea that is the threat recedes, U.S. presence should narrow or lower. I think there's a logic to that makes sense. But there are a couple flaws with the ways that it has been done to date, and I think Eugene has pointed them out rather effectively. The first is that President Trump put the cart before the horse, signaling that he's willing to withdraw troops before getting anything in return from it from North Korea. The second is that it will feed into a narrative in Asia and around the world of U.S. withdrawal. And this may be an area that there's a bit of divergence amongst the four of us. But it's TPP, the Iran deal, the Paris deal, the Iran deal. There's enough data points to draw a pattern here. And if we withdraw from the Korean Peninsula, it will further harden those perceptions that the United States is withdrawing and retreating. And the effect of that is it will put incredible stress on Japan as the last country that has a significant American troop presence in Asia. And if Japan feels so much pressure that it strains its political system, and the United States is forced to withdraw, then we're back to the situation that we were discussing earlier, where countries are now faced with a choice between accommodating China or taking drastic measures, including going nuclear, to defend themselves against China. And that, in my mind, leads us to the worst case outcome of the increased risk of catastrophic conflict in the Asia-Pacific.
Great. We are unfortunately out of time, so thank you to all of our debaters for tonight's overview of China. So before we all run out of here for the night, we want to ask each of our debaters for a brief 90-second closing thoughts with final takeaways from the event tonight and potentially any advice for the audience about how they can continue to engage with these topics. So Ryan, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you all. It's an incredible tribute to Seattle that so many of you would stay for this entire discussion to listen to us wrestle over China issues. So thank you for being a participant in this exercise. The only thought that I would leave you with is the one thing that I hope that we tried to highlight is that we need to demand more from our leaders. We need to demand a serious strategy for dealing with the most consequential relationship that the United States faces. And this isn't a partisan issue, this isn't a 2018 issue, this is a long-term issue. This is an issue that will have a significant bearing upon our lives, the lives of our children, and I think that we must demand informed, thoughtful, strategic thinking about the way forward with China.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here. I want to leave you with something which is more about the future, because it's easy to talk about what's going to happen and predict, as Eugene said, it's very hard. But the point I want to say is, the future is being decided now in the decisions that we make, and the decisions they make, and the decisions you make. Right? There is no other way to do it. And when I have a relatively optimistic view of what's going on, I think we're way better than we were 50 years ago in the region. My father left Korea 2 years after the end of the Korean War. We're so much better off. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to continually keep up a relationship, both diplomatic, this is what's happening. And the future is going to depend on the decisions we make today. And so to that, I think that hopefully the future's in good hands.
Bonnie?
So if you look over the history of the United States, I think you find there's always been a lot of tension between being more engaged overseas or being isolationist, being more of a free trader or being protectionist, or being more of a continental power or maritime power. And I think that we will face these challenges going forward. We should not look at anything as black and white, and China's rise and how we deal with China also just should not be black and white. In my view, China it's not in, the rival enemy word is not the best term to use. China is a competitor, and that can be good for us, but we have to make sure that there is a level playing field. And I think it's really important for people in Washington to listen more to people who are outside the Beltway. I think you should be up there, and I should be out in the audience, that we really need to listen to what the concerns of Americans are. And I hope that the American people will make the people in Washington more responsive to their concerns and listen going forward. So thank you for having me.
Eugene?
I also would like to thank you all for coming and staying through this, and thank the organizers of this. I think the Brookings Charles Koch Institute series bringing debates like this around the country has been tremendously valuable, and I hope will continue. On U.S.-China relations, the key thing I'd like to leave you with is something which I mentioned briefly before, is the results of the trajectory of military technology. I think actually, Jacqueline asked David earlier, are there threats to stability? What are the threats? Actually, maybe Mona asked that. What are the threats? He says things are more stable now than they have been in 150 years. What threatens that? And I think the answer is the U.S. failure to react to the changing military technology. Like understanding that it's harder to project power into the region, and that's good for us because it makes it easier to for the allies to defend themselves, and it's bad for us because the way that we've been trying to defend our allies is getting harder, riskier, and more costly, and is leading us to spend a lot of money on pretty aggressive R&D systems that we're trying to invest in to develop to threaten China, and promising to attack the Chinese homeland in the case of a military conflict because we need to stop their A2AD capability, right? That military technology, if we keep doing what we've been doing, we become the threat to stability in the region. We make conflict more likely, and we should adapt to that. And we can achieve our goals of security, prosperity, and liberty through a different mechanism that would make us all much safer.
Great, this has been such an interesting conversation. I hope everyone in our audience enjoyed as well. Please continue to follow this series for the final debate of the season on June 13th in Detroit, which is about globalization and the American worker. And please let us know how we did tonight on Twitter using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld. Thank you so much all for joining us, and good night.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.